From the head to the heart, you take me on a journey of letting go, getting lost in you. From the head to the heart, you take me on a journey.
Hey, National Park Church, here for week 3 of our study of what Scripture is and how do we read it well. Our study is entitled Scriptural Imagination. I'm going to do this each week before we actually get into the material that's specific for this week's class. I'm going to do the reminder of the 4 hermeneutical principles that help us interpret Scripture well. I think it's just really important for us to keep those in the forefront of our minds as we engage with this topic. So the 4 hermeneutical principles are, number 1, Christ is the interpretive key, that all of Scripture is read rightly through the lens of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, and ascension. Number 2 is that our reading of Scripture should always lead us to love God more and love our neighbor. Number 3 is that Scripture is not a book just for isolated individuals, but it is the church's book. It is God's gift to His community of people, not just to us individually. It can be read individually, but it finds its fullest expression in the life of the church. And number 4, we need each other to read it well. So in continuity with what we said with this being the church's book, I need you and you need me to read Scripture well. And so this week, as we continue our journey in our class about scriptural imagination, we're going to see the diversity of literary genres that make up what we call the Bible. And as the past few videos have been, this is going to be overview. And just to give you a little hint of what's going to come in the future, we're going to look at the videos that actually do get in a little bit more detail about how do we look at these specific genres and read them well. But for this week's video, the Bible Project is primarily just laying out for us what are those different genres that make up the Bible, and it's more of an introductory material. So as we do each week, I want us to begin with that video, and then we will have some discussion after that. And just to give you a heads up, the discussion will be primarily about living in the tension that's created by the diversity of the biblical text itself. And so I look forward to our time together, and enjoy this video with me.
The Bible is a collection of many books, telling one unified story from beginning to end. But all those books were written in different literary styles.
Yeah, think of it like walking into a bookstore where every aisle has a different kind of literature. There's history or poetry or nonfiction. And when you choose an aisle and pick up a book, you're going to have very different expectations, different things that you're looking for.
Right, they're all literature, but they communicate in really different ways.
Yes, and so the same thing is true for the Bible. If you don't pay attention to what style it's written in, you will miss out on the brilliance of each book.
So, what are the main types of literature in the Bible?
Well, first and foremost is narrative. It makes up a whopping 43% of the Bible. After that is poetry, which is 33% of the Bible. And then there's what you could call prose discourse, which makes up the remaining 24%.
Nearly half the Bible is narrative.
Yes, and this is no accident. Stories are the most universal form of human communication. Our brains are actually hardwired to take in information through stories.
And stories are really enjoyable. Why is that?
Well, stories train us to make sense of the seemingly random events that happen in life by taking those events and then putting them in a sequence. And then together you can start to see the meaning and purpose of it all.
And what links this all together?
Well, good stories always have a character who wants something. And then through these characters, an author can explore life's big questions, like who are we, or what's really important in life. And a good story always involves some kind of conflict.
Some challenge to overcome, just like in our own lives.
And that forces us to think about our own challenges, why there's so much pain or disappointment in the world, and then what can we do about it? And stories usually end with some kind of resolution. giving us hope for our own stories.
Since these are Bible stories, are the characters showing me how I should live?
Yeah, that's not quite the point. Most Bible characters are deeply flawed. You should not be like them. But we are supposed to see ourselves in them, which helps us then see our lives and failures from a new perspective. And without even realizing it, these stories will start to mess with you and change how you see the world and other people and yourself.
Now, there are different types of narrative in the Bible.
Yeah, there's historical narrative, but also narrative parables, short biographical narratives like the four Gospels. We'll look at all these in later videos.
Okay, next up is poetry, which honestly, I don't read a lot of.
Yeah, you're like most people. But 1 out of every 3 chapters in the Bible is poetry.
Yeah, why so much poetry?
Well, poems mainly speak through dense, creative language, linking together images to help us envision the world differently. Poems use lots of metaphor to evoke your emotions and your imagination.
Lots of fancy language, but wouldn't it be easier just to tell me what I need to know?
Well, think about it. In life, we tend to form mental ruts, and we think in these familiar, well-worn paths that are very hard to get out of through logic or reasoning. And what good poetry does is force you off the familiar path into new territory.
Sneaky.
And there's different types of poetry in the Bible. There's lots of types of songs or psalms. There's the reflective poetry of the wisdom books, and then the passionate resistance poetry of the prophets.
Okay, the last big literary type is called prose discourse, and it makes up a quarter of the Bible.
Yeah, these are speeches, letters, or essays. And the focus here is building a sequence of ideas or thoughts into one linear argument that requires a logical response. Like, hey, have you thought about this thing? You should also consider how it connects to this other thing. And if you do, then you will see that this is the result. And in light of that conclusion, therefore, you should probably stop doing that one thing so that this other thing will be the outcome.
So you're persuading me with reason.
Yeah, discourse forces you to think logically and consistently and then do something about it. Biblical discourse is found in law collections, in wisdom literature, and the letters written by the apostles.
Okay, so each book of the Bible has one literary style.
No, actually most books have a primary literary style, like narrative, for example, but then embedded in the narrative you'll come across poems or parables or a collection of laws. Every biblical book is a unique combination of literary styles.
And to read that book well, I need to be familiar with each literary type and how it works.
Yeah, so you know what to pay attention to and what questions you should ask. But before we look at each type, there's one more unifying feature of biblical literature that's really important and really cool, and that's what we'll explore next.
I think the Bible Project, again, did a really helpful job framing the particular topic that we're looking at and naming the different literary genres. I think for me, growing up in church, the Bible was just this book that we have, and it's our authoritative scripture, but I never really thought about the different genres that made up this one particular text. I mean, I kind of read everything the same, so if we're in Romans, I'm going to read it the same way that I read Psalms, and if I'm in Proverbs, I'm going to read it the same way that I read Leviticus, because it's the Bible, right? You read the Bible in the same way, no matter where you're looking at it. And what I think the Bible Project does in thinking about the different genres reminds us is there's a complexity there, that there's a skill set to be able to read Scripture well. Now, I don't think that actually should lead us into this intimidating experience, assuming, oh, well, there's no way that I can do that. Number one, as we've talked about, and it's one of our hermeneutical principles, it actually encompasses 2 of them, it's the church's book, and we're to read it together. And so there's a lot of incredible resources, and there's a lot of people that we can think with. And the beauty is that in the life of the church, we have all these different forms of expression about our relationship with God, what God's like, what we're like, what the world's like. And so it's not an endeavor that you have to engage with alone. Number 2, I think it's actually a really beautiful gift because our lives are not simplistic, right? So my existence in the world and your existence in the world could hardly be described by just one literary genre. That actually the beauty of Scripture is that it's able to encompass so much of reality because it refuses to be only one kind of thing. And I think the Bible Project video captures that for us in a very compelling and understandable way. And so what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about this tension that the diversity of literary genres creates for us, but I want to look at it from the perspective as not a hurdle that we have to overcome, but actually as a gift that God has given us. I think one way we could start by looking at that is looking at one of the stories in Genesis about where Israel got its name from. And the story is about Jacob. It's a famous story that many of us are familiar with, but it's that night where Jacob, the son of Isaac, is wrestling with, he's described as a man in the story, but we find out this figure is an angel, or in a certain way it's saying that Jacob wrestled with God. And they wrestle all night long. And eventually it's determined Jacob's not going to stop. We're not going to easily stop Jacob. He's wrestling us intensely. And so what this figure does is touches Jacob's hip, and it disables him and injures him. And Jacob says, okay, but I'm not going to let go until you bless me. And one of the blessings that's given Jacob is his name is changed to Israel. And I wonder if that can maybe be a way in which we can understand our relationship with God in general and our relationship with Scripture as well. That one of the origin stories of how Israel became a particular kind of people is this story. And this story is not an easy, relaxed, comfortable kind of relationship. It reflects a wrestling, a tension, being in battle with God. Now, I don't think we need to think about it as animosity, but that there's a tension there. That being the people of God from the very origin is not this simplistic engagement, but it can be identified and described as a wrestling. And I think we see this in the biblical story. For example, one of the ways in which the complex literary genres provide tension is things are not said in one kind of way. And that creates in and of itself tension. It would be similar to putting in a room a logician, someone who spends their entire day and night thinking about logic. And they teach logic, and that's the way in which they frame almost everything, and then putting them in a room with a poet. Now, they probably are talking about the same exact topic, but by the end of the night, they're going to be deeply frustrated with one another because the way in which they describe the same topic, the same discussion is going to be so different. I think we see that in the biblical text itself. That sometimes when you read Paul, you go, okay, there's this complex argument, and I see where he's going with it. And you can trace it out, and there's a way of reading that where you feel like, okay, I got the conclusion that he was coming to. But then you can read the Psalms, and man, if you try to read the Psalms the same way that you read the Apostle Paul, you're going to come to some really strange and weird conclusions. But we probably have felt the tension of reading both. I know after one of the classes where we engaged with the book of Romans, one of our members was talking to me and just said, honestly, I think Paul can be a little bit wordy. I think he could have summed up his point a lot more simply and a lot more succinctly. And I think we've all felt a little bit of that tension when we've wrestled with the biblical text. But I think that tension expands beyond just the fact that, man, we have a lot of different writing styles that make up the one book of Scripture. And so that in and of itself brings about some tension. But there's actually tension in the text themselves. So for example, one that's seen really, really clearly in the Old Testament is the book of Proverbs, and you also see it in a lot of Deuteronomy, lays out reality seemingly in a simplistic fashion. So it seems as if Proverbs often teaches, if you do X, then Y will be the outcome. So for example, if you parent your child in this way, then you should expect that your child will turn out to be like this. Or if you are really good with money, then you should expect that you become wealthy. And it seems like these very easy, if you do one thing, then here's the outcome of doing a particular thing in that way. So it seems very simplistic. Okay, all I need to do is I need to do the right thing, and the right outcome is going to take place. Well, within the Old Testament itself, there seems to be a challenge to that simplistic notion, which is the book of Job and Ecclesiastes. For example, if I read Job the way that Proverbs simplistically read seems to lead me to want to read Job, then I would say, okay, Job's been a really good guy, so what he can expect is a really, really good outcome, and things are going to go really, really well for him. Well, if you're familiar with the story of Job at all, you know that that's not how the story goes at all. Job is a righteous man. He's a faithful man. He does the right thing. He has a relationship with God. And he basically almost loses everything. And so the question is, okay, do we make the choice, is Deuteronomy and Proverbs right, or is Job and Ecclesiastes right? I think what Scripture would tell us to do and what God is inviting us to do is sit in that tension. Sit with that tension. Experience that tension. Jesus somewhat weighs into this. If you remember in John chapter 9, there's a man who's been born blind, and the discussion that's happening around this man's life is it his sin or is it the sin of his parents? And Jesus says, well, this particular case is done so that I can manifest the glory of God. But what Jesus seems to do is he seems to avoid giving a simplistic answer that says, this is the reason this man is born blind. But that we're going to be invited into sitting with the tension of some of these things. That part of what Scripture is doing is not giving us an overly simplistic answer, because an overly simplistic answer cannot capture the essence of our relationship with God, our existence in the world, and then ultimately what God is like. That's in the wrestling itself that we find a correct posture as we engage with Scripture and as we engage in the world as the people of God. I think this is actually a really, really important lesson, and I think that the tension itself is given to us in Scripture so that we will be the kind of people that continues to grow. Because imagine this, and I'll give a human example, so it has its limitations when we're talking about our relationship with God. But imagine if I went to Kara, or you went to your spouse, and I went home to her today and I said, hey, we've lived together for over 6 years, and some of you have lived together with your spouse a lot longer, and so you probably could say this a little bit more confidently, but I went to her and I said, I think I have you figured out. I have it all figured out. I know what you're like. I know what you dislike. I know how to be the kind of person you need me to be in every single situation. There's going to be no more tension. There's going to be no more conflict. There's going to be no more mystery. I think, one, that would be an extremely arrogant statement. But that would also signal something that I think is really, really scary. To a certain degree, it would signal the end of our relationship. Because the dynamic nature of a relationship means that it's not that you've figured something out, but that you're living in the real engagement with another person. I think that if we do the same thing with God, and if we do that as we engage with Scripture, if we say we got it figured out, there's no more tension, there's no more struggle, or to use the story of Jacob that we referenced earlier, there's no more wrestling, then to a certain degree, then there's no more thinking on my part, and there's no more transformation that is needed. But God has offered us a text that is not simplistic, because life itself is not simplistic, but it also day in and day out invites us into a community of people that are going to wrestle with these texts that cannot be simply deduced, but invite us into a complex and diverse relationship with God. And I want to conclude with this. It is an invitation into a kind of tension, but I also think that it invites us into a realm or a space that's able to capture things that if it only chose one genre, the Bible would not be able to capture. I love the letters of Paul. I think I come by it honestly if you know anything about my family history. But I love the letters of Paul. And I love the way I can trace his arguments. But I'm thankful that not every book in the Bible is that way. Because I think there's things that are captured in the prophetic literature that's dominated by poetry or the Psalms that Paul's logical arguments can't fully capture. And you've probably had that experience, right? You've probably listened, many who are listening to this class have listened to a lot of sermons. And you've probably listened to a lot of sermons on the cross. But I'm guessing that there is a line in a hymn about the cross that has captured the essence of the cross that 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 sermons could have never captured for you. Because that particular form of language captures something that another kind of form, like is expressed in preaching, could not capture. But what we have in Scripture is not just one way of doing it, but a broad, diverse way of capturing the essence of reality and capturing what your relationship with God and what my relationship with God is like. And what we will find is it's never one that's fully settled, but always invites us into a deeper mystery and more tension. And on a practical note, I wonder if this invitation into tension, this invitation into the dynamic relationship with God, and this diversity of literature that we have can be a really nice example of the kind of community that we need to have with one another. That we don't necessarily need to see each other as competing when we have different perspectives or different ways of articulating things, but actually that may be God's gift to sit more deeply with the tension of God, because as we sit with the tension of God, we become more formed into his Son's image. That maybe God has not given a kind of simplistic unity where everything is easy to figure out, and actually he's invited us into a real dynamic relationship, not only with himself, but with one another. And it's in the tension, in the complexity of our relationship together, that the fullness of God's truth is manifested to his people. I wonder if our posture towards Scripture, where we don't easily synthesize material, but we allow the diversity of the text itself to work on us and to have the capacity to sit with some of that tension, can allow us also in our communal life together to sit with the tensions of the differing ways in which we articulate really, really important things. And I think that would be a beautiful gift and practical application of our engagement with Scripture this way. But my encouragement with you is lean on your community as we read these texts together. And I encourage you to dive into the beautiful and diverse body of literature that is Scripture. Love you guys.
From the head